This conference will now be recorded.
Jim, I'm going to step away for just a minute. I'll be right back.
All right.
Jim, how long do you want me to wait to begin the meeting? Maybe a couple more minutes?
We can get started, Tony. And if we don't have a quorum, we'll just go ahead and do the presentation.
Okay. Let me just pull up the, or actually, could staff pull up the agenda so I could read from that to call the meeting to order? Or do you want me to just read from the agenda on my computer? I'm okay with that too.
Tony, if you just read the agenda, that'll be fine. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me pull it up here. Okay, all, welcome to today's meeting. I'm going to be acting chair of RWA board today. Our normal chair, new chair, Dan York, is traveling, so I had to, as vice chair, act on his behalf. And I'm going to go ahead and call to order the Regional Water Authority Board of Directors special meeting of Tuesday, January 18th, 2022, with the main topic of water conservation rulemaking update. And so if I could have staff conduct roll call, thank you.
Yes, this is Cecilia, and I will do that for you. California American.
Buddy Foster, present.
Carmichael Water District.
Okay, no problem. Already. Got it.
Carmichael Water District.
You bet. Okay.
Citrus Heights Water District.
Hillary Strauss for Citrus Heights Water.
Thank you, Hillary. City of Folsom.
Marcus Yasutaki here.
City of Lincoln. City of Roseville.
Sean Bigley here for City of Bristol.
City of Sacramento,
Ann Sanger here for City of Sacramento.
and City of West Sacramento.
William Roberts is present. Great job, Tony.
City of Yuba City,
Diana Langley here for Yuba City.
Del Paso Manor Water District, El Dorado Irrigation District,
Brian
Elk Grove
Mueller here
Water-
for EID.
Thank you. Elk Grove Water District,
Bruce Camillo's here.
Fair Oaks Water District,
Randy Marks here.
Golden State Water Company,
Paul Schubert here.
Orangeville Water Company,
Joe Duran, present.
Placer County Water Agency,
Robert Dugan, present. Tony Ferenzi, I think, is also present.
I am. I wasn't sure if I had to say present since I opened the meeting, but I'll leave that to Cecilia.
I got you. Rancho Marietta Community Services District, Sacramento County Water Agency,
Patrick Kennedy's here.
Sacramento Suburban Water District, San Juan Water District,
Sorry, Cecilia. Greg Bundeson's on the line from Sac Suburban. I don't know if I count though.
okay, and San Juan Water District.
Greg Zlotnick is on.
Okay, you do have a quorum present.
By the way, this is Ron Greenwood, Carmichael Water District. I had to step out, and I believe Kathy Lee is here as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia, and thank you everybody for being present. We have a quorum. Next item on the agenda is public comment. This is a time for members of the public who wish to address the board to do so on matters that are not already on the agenda. Please keep your comments to less than 3 minutes if you have any. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak? Okay, seeing none there, thank you. The next item on the agenda, item 3, water conservation rulemaking update. And I believe there's a staff presentation on this, so hand it over that way. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. This is Jim. I'm going to make a few comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amy Talbot. The purpose of this meeting today is to give our board members a status report on the water conservation legislation rulemaking process. As many of you may remember, there were 2 bills passed by the legislature, I think around 2017, signed into law, which provided new requirements for water use efficiency and water conservation and water planning. It's been some time since we've done a presentation for you to update the board on this. Amy Talbot here at the RWA has been tracking this quite a bit and putting a lot of time into the development of the regulations. She's going to do a presentation. The presentation is probably going to take or her part of this is probably going to take about a half hour, and then we're going to go into some questions and answers. And then I'd like to do a wrap up to talk about the politics and the policy surrounding some of this. So with that, Amy, please take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Talbot. I'm the Water Efficiency Program Manager, and I'm going to be kind of leading us through this presentation and discussion today. Just wanted to give you a brief overview of what I'll cover. I'm going to go into a little bit of the details of Senate Bill 606 and AB 1668, which collectively are known as the conservation regulation, primarily focusing on the supplier water budgets. That's the main component of those 2 pieces of legislation. I'll go into the status of each of those components. There's 4 of them. Then I'll go over a list of outstanding concerns that we have as water efficiency professionals in the region and pretty much applicable to the rest of the state. I'm going to cover RWA's leadership roles during the process of developing the regulation on the supplier water budgets. and then we'll collectively talk about next steps, and then I'll turn it over to Jim. Okay, so to get us started, I just wanted to use this graphic because I think it perfectly summarizes the conservation regulations and the water supplier budget. So each supplier has what's known as a water agency water use objective. For a lack of better terms, I call it a target because I find objective is distracting. So we'll call it target throughout the presentation. Your water supplier wide target is made up of 4 different components. You can see them here: residential indoor use, which is single family, multifamily; residential outdoor use, which is your landscape, your yards and lawns; commercial, industrial, institutional landscape, which is landscape area covered by dedicated irrigation meters, not laundries, not salons, nothing like that, just anything that's on a dedicated irrigation meter. And then finally, your water loss standard, which represents water loss at the system level, not at the customer level. The first 3 are all customer based. Water loss is the only one that's system specific. And then you're going to add all of those budgets up, which I'll explain how that works. Then you get some variances, which I'll cover, that are kind of one-offs if you have livestock, something like that. And then there's also a recycled water bonus. So all of these different components kind of roll up to your supplier specific wide budget. So before I get into the details of each of those 4 components, I wanted to give us kind of some context of like, what does it mean to meet these budgets? You know, what does compliance mean in terms of this regulation? So a couple key points here. The water targets, your water supplier wide targets, are based on overall water use of water from that water provider. So it's not a specific customer. You're not going to go to a house and say, you have 5 gallons you can use for indoor, and then go to the next customer and say the same thing. It is only for the supplier wide budget purposes. Then water agencies, you don't need to meet each standard individually, but you can choose which strategy to deploy to meet the overall objective. So what this means is those 4 parts, the indoor, outdoor, dedicated irrigation meter, and water loss, in the spirit of the regulation, they are all supposed to not be met individually, but collectively. So let's say you were over on your outdoor use, you could make it up by being under on your indoor use. So that was really what the spirit of the regulation and legislation was supposed to do. However, there's a little kink in that now it's determined that you could be penalized for not meeting your water loss one individually. We'll go into more detail about that later. But for now, think this is not customer focused, supplier focused, that there is some flexibility in each of those components, and that all of those targets will be rolled up to a number of gallons. And then compliance is determined by comparing that target and those budgets with your relevant meter data. And then you're kind of deemed over and under budget. You know, if your use is higher than the target, you're over budget. If your use is lower than the target, then you're under budget. So there's a couple of just some dynamics to keep in mind as we go through the different areas. So our first area here, we're going to go to indoor. This is indoor residential. Again, this applies to single family and multifamily properties. Basically what it is you get a budget. For right now, it's 55 gallons per capita per day. You times that by the number of people that is in your service area, your population, and then you times that by 365 days, and that gives you your annual budget for indoor use. You can see here in the light blue on top, the current standard for indoor use from the legislation is set out here, and it progressively gets less over time. This is the only standard that was determined in the legislation. The rest of them are being developed right now. So you can see 2020, we start with 55 gallons, then we go down to 52.5, and then we go down to 50 in 2030. So an important part of the legislation is that a part of it basically laid out that DWR needed to do a study to assess if these numbers in the legislation were on base and were thought to be okay, for a lack of a better term. So DWR did a study and they looked at water use on indoors, looking at EIR data and doing some kind of back of the envelope analysis, and determined that we could actually go lower from their analysis. So the recommended report came out with indoor targets that are lower than the current legislation. And you can see those in the dark blue. This was a joint DWR and State Water Resources Control report. So you'll see the difference, same in 2020, start with 55, but then you get down to 42 gallons per capita per day in 2030 instead of 50 with the current legislation. So we know now that this recommended report is essentially released, that there will be new legislation that will include DWR's recommendation to try to ratchet the indoor targets lower. Ryan's going to get into this a little bit later through discussion, but just know things are a little in flux. They were kind of written in stone, so to speak, in the legislation to begin with, but now things are changing. Okay, so now we've got residential outdoor use. This is the tricky one. Your budget is essentially made up landscape area, which was determined by DWR through using aerial imagery, basically using Google Maps and selecting out single family and multifamily parcels, and then measuring that lawn area, and then measuring it for all those parcels, all the residential parcels in your service area. Then those landscape areas get added up, and then that specific square footage gets multiplied by a water use budget, saying this is how much water we think you should use for this specific landscape. There are a ton of more details into this, which I'm more than happy to go over in questions or one-on-one, but the basics is you have a landscape area, it's multiplied by an allowable water budget. All of that gets rolled up at the supplier-wide level, and then that is your allowable water, outdoor water use for residential. One detail I do want to just barely touch on is there's the concept between irrigated landscape area and irrigable not irrigated. Irrigated is basically the aerial imagery says, yes, we know through our analysis that that piece of grass is watered actively. Then there's irrigable not currently irrigated, which is the aerial imagery says this looks a lot like landscape area that could be watered that is not currently watered. And these two different categories are discriminated against with the statewide legislation and could lead to some complications depending on how DWR finalizes the determination. Okay, third area, commercial, industrial, institutional landscape area. This is the standard for only for accounts with dedicated irrigation meters. So it's not for regular CII use. It's only like standalone landscape meters. And this this number, my understanding is this number can range from 50 meters to some of the larger agencies that have several hundred to 1,000 of these meters. This has the same concept as the outdoor water, where basically you measure a landscape area and multiply that by an allowable water budget or allowable water use. The difference with this one is that with residential indoor, the state measured those landscape areas for you and essentially gave you a spreadsheet with totals in it saying you have X amount of square footage. With this one, they are not measuring the landscape area for you. It is up to the suppliers to go out and map the landscape area for their dedicated irrigation meters. And it's up to the suppliers to then plug that number in and calculate your water use budget based on the equation DWR gives you. So this one, I know agencies are working on because a lot of this work has previously not been done. And so this one is going to need some work to make sure that everyone's prepared to calculate their budgets. So you might be wondering what's going on with the rest of the commercial. So, we focus super hard on this dedicated irrigation meters, but what about the rest of commercial use? So for that, the state is developing performance measures, basically recommendations on certain sectors, and they'll have, sector appropriate recommendations. So let's say salons will have a separate, here are the 3 things you could do to save water and be more efficient. And pet stores might have another set of performance measures that are different. So this one is more, it's more a recommendation and not as calculated. It's not like a numeric thing. It's more of like a best practices. The state has been soliciting additional information on the commercial sector, which includes classification of commercial accounts. So right now, agencies usually classify different types of CII businesses in different ways. The state's looking to have a more uniform classification system. They're also discussing a minimum threshold for dedicated meters. So if you have mixed meters right now, sometime in the future, they might say meters above this size need to split indoor and outdoor use and install a dedicated irrigation meter. And then again, they're soliciting information on best practices by sector. So they'll have a document for that. The studies have been ongoing for a while and working off previous work at the state level. So we're not starting from scratch on this one. And the idea is to adopt these performance measures by June of this year, which we're not sure if that will happen. Okay, our last and final area is the water loss standard. And this again applies not to customer use, but system use, so at the supplier level. The target for this one is based on a real loss economic model that was developed by the State Water Board, and the output or the metric is in gallons per connection per day. It's worth saying that this process started separately from the rest of these the previous three components, because it started a little bit sooner with Senate Bill 555. So this one is going through the State Water Board first and did not kind of travel through DWR for any sort of recommendations. Most suppliers in our region, according to the economic model based on default data, need to reduce water loss from their baseline, which is 2017 through 2020, by 30 to 90% by 2028. So that's pretty strict standard there. However, suppliers can submit changes to the economic model and the inputs that are in there for approval from the State Water Board until July 1st, 2023 to get a reduced target. So let's say instead of having to reduce by 40%, some agencies in our region have already submitted changes and only need to maintain their current loss, and in some cases have higher targets than their current loss. And again, this is a separate process that went through the State Water Board, did not travel the same path as the other three through DWR. Okay, so we've gone through the 4 components. Now there's 2 other kind of, I wouldn't say wild cards, but there's 2 other components that could make changes to your supplier specific target. One of those is variances, and DWR is developing kind of guidance on if you want to submit for a variance. You can see the uses there. So if an agency has a lot of ag area, or has horses, or has larger lots or seasonal populations like, South Lake Tahoe, then they can get all of their budget components together, all 4 of those, but then ask and request a variance because of these specific needs. And then there's the potable reuse bonus incentive, where you can get up to 15% back, a credit of up to 15% of your water use objective for potable reuse water delivered to residential water users in CII landscape areas. So these are the 2 things that kind of tack on to the end of the other 4 components. Okay, so to wrap it all up again, so your supplier-wide water agency objective or target is made up of indoor residential use, that 55 gallons per person per day times 365 days times your population served. Your outdoor residential use, which is essentially landscape area for single family and multifamily times allowable water use. Then your CII dedicated irrigation accounts, which is essentially that same or different landscape area times the same allowable water use. Then plus your water loss standard, which is gallons per connection per day, which is a function of the economic model. Then you plus your variances and plus recycled water bonus. And then all of those things add up together and you end up with a number of gallons for that year that is your allowable water use. Oops. And so what happens then is then an agency would take all of those targets together and then you pull the corresponding meter data for indoor, well, really for residential use, the dedicated irrigation meters, and you pull it from your water loss audits, and then you see if you're under or over that target. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of it. Again, there's a ton more detail, happy to dive in if we want to, but I just wanted to outline some outstanding concerns that we have. So we've been going to these meetings for years now, and there's, I think, still some very strong concerns that we have as water efficiency professionals, and I think as a region. The first one is first and foremost that is kind of active right now is the new indoor standard via the legislation. That is the concern, a very real concern, that there's going to be a bill that will take DWR's recommended lower indoor use and get that approved and essentially replace the existing higher indoor targets. The main concern with the outdoor standards is that they don't incorporate some valid technical research and practical implementation experience that water suppliers and academic institutions and irrigation professionals have brought up at these meetings time and time again. The main concern there is that it might lead to deficit irrigation where the budgets are so small that it's going to force residents to water so much less that will have unhealthy landscapes and trees and exacerbate climate change impacts. The main concern with the water loss is the economic model overstates benefits and understates cost. We have several consultant reports that clearly display this. The main issue with this is that we would end up with cost prohibitive water loss targets unless the inputs in the model for your specific supplier are changed. And I am happy to report that some agencies in our region have changed those and gotten way more reasonable targets. It's just that the basis of the model is unsound. There's also the concern that DWR in its recommendations is essentially maxing out the water efficiency potential in each of the 4 areas and therefore reducing the compliance flexibility in the spirit of the original legislation was that we're not going to tell you you have to meet each indoor or outdoor target. We just have to collectively meet it and then you'll be fine. And then you get to choose as a supplier which area you want to invest in. However, if DWR is maxing out each of these 4 areas, you really don't have compliance, you don't have flexibility to make it up in any one area because you're maxing out everything. Then Paul says, maxing out, do you mean them unrealistically? Yes, that is what I mean. And then finally, there's the really unclear enforcement process. So there's fines that are stipulated in the legislation, but it's really unclear at what point do those kick in. And the State Water Board has said that they want to use kind of like a friendlier of option of working with each agency before they step into the fining arena. However, when you have these kind of more, less clear options, agencies can't really make a conscious choice of like, okay, I'm really gonna I have to meet these targets or I get fined this much. Like that sort of logic is not clearly defined and therefore makes decisions and implementation strategies a little harder to kind of nail down. Okay, so what has RWA been doing the last couple of years to help with this process, to be involved in this process? I just broke it out by each component. For the indoor, RWA staff and many of our suppliers' staff have been active in the Aqua work group. RWA provided examples of inconsistencies with the indoor recommendations and also on the ground experience from running programs and indoor direct install programs for the Aqua Coalition letter that was included for the statewide letter. And then staff have been going to numerous state water board and DWR meetings. This includes meetings not only with staff and the public meetings, but with upper management at both of those organizations. For outdoor, again, RWA has been active in the Aqua work group. RWA contracted with Land IQ for analysis for 5 of our agencies to essentially mirror the analysis that DWR has been doing, so we could compare and contrast and find the strengths and weaknesses in both of the approaches, the methodologies. And we also provided a training to water efficiency staff on kind of what is a landscape budget, what is the equation that is going to be used, how do we understand each component of it, so that water efficiency staff could go back and look at their own data within their agency to try to get a better understanding, of if we're going to make the target or not. And we wanted to do that before the final comments were due to DWR. And then we also provided examples for the coalition letters. We provided our Land IQ final report that we also did an additional analysis on. We've been working with UC Davis and have obtained a couple of studies from them to also show how DWR's recommendations are not technically sound. We've been having numerous meetings, again, with State Water Board staff and DWR staff. Again, that's at the staff level, also upper management level, and also attending the public meetings. We've also kind of pulled partners in to help support our position. And that includes Sacramento Tree Foundation that's attended meetings with State Water Board members, also give testimony at public meetings. And then again, we've also pulled in academia like UC Davis, even partnering with SoCal academic institutions through some of our supplier partners down there, and basically asking them to attend the meetings and provide their own testimony. For the CII dedicated irrigation meter, this had a little bit of a late start, and so there haven't been as many meetings on this one. So RWA is primarily engaged through the Aqua work group here. And then for water loss, we've again been staying active at the Aqua work group. I'm the chair of the Aqua water loss committee. I'm also the chair of the Cal Nevada AWWA water loss committee and regulations subcommittee. We've written numerous coalition letters, and the coalition includes Aqua, CMUA, AWWA, and RWA. We've commissioned a memo from Water Systems Optimization, WSO, to point out the weaknesses in the model and the inflexibility with changing the inputs. We've also commissioned a memo from David Mitchell through M-Cubed, doing more of the same, basically analysis on the State Water Board's model and then submitting those. And then again, we've been going to all the State Water Board meetings. I've also set up bi-weekly meetings with State Water Board staff just to make sure that we are staying in connection with each other throughout this water loss regulation process. And then we have a separate water loss group just for RWA as well. And then in general, RWA CalWEP, California Water Efficiency Partnership, which is a local nonprofit here focused solely on water efficiency, and Aqua have joined forces to create a page that's hosted on CalWEP's website that has updates for all of these, including comment letters and presentations. So at any one time, an agency can go to the website and see kind of where we're at. Okay, so moving on timeline-wise, what do we look forward to next? Well, right now we're in the middle of the water loss formal rulemaking, which is the final approval before the water loss targets kind of become set in stone, at least for now. Comments are due on February 11th. There will be a an extension of 15 days. We're anticipating that, but for now, our comments are due February 11th. Early 2022, we're expecting the recommendations from DWR on the water use efficiency standards. So that's the outdoor residential, the CII dedicated accounts, and the CII performance measures, variances, and guidelines for calculating the target. All of that is right now in DWR's court. It's supposed to shift to the State Water Board and then go through a final approval process, again, with more public meetings, but basically just moving through the regulatory body, and then whatever gets decided there and finally approved is what we implement. So we do think that if we haven't commented enough, we have additional time and opportunity to do that through these mirror State Water Board periods. We're anticipating June 2022, the adoption of the water use efficiency standards and the water loss standards by the State Water Board. However, almost every deadline that has been associated with this regulation has been missed. And so I can see that that might happen again. We just, at this point, we do not know exactly what the timeline is. However, according to legislation, the first date that agencies have to submit their budgets, basically submit their meter data to match those 4 components, is January 1st, 2024. So as far as we know, this is the timeline we're working with. But again, everything has been so much in flux with this. And, and for example, the water loss regulation is about 2 years behind schedule. So what are our next steps considering this timeline? Well, we're going to continue to provide feedback in the form of attending the meetings, comment letters, and then kind of one-on-one meetings, both the DWR and State Water Board. I'm encouraging all suppliers to assess their compliance with what we know about these 4 components. Both DWR and State Water Board have created essentially models where you can pull up as a supplier and see where your agency likely is going to land on each of these 4 components. They were supposed to be releasing these models. We don't know when and if that's going to happen. The other complication is that there are 2 separate models using the similar data with somewhat different outcomes. So we're not quite sure what will happen with that. And then next steps also are to customize the water loss economic model. That means going in and changing some of the inputs of the model to get an improved water loss standard. And I'm helping host a free training scheduled for January 27th to be able to do that. We already have about 80 agencies throughout the state registered for that. And then Ryan is going to help us, no pressure Ryan, on the new indoor legislation strategy and response with DWR's recommendation of those lower indoor standards to try to figure out where that's going to land, because we think that's going to move forward. And then with that, I wanted to hand things over to Jim to give us some kind of comments and lead us into our question and answer session. And thanks for joining us, Ryan.
Thank you, Amy. We're going to get to questions in just a minute. I just want to see, Ryan, if you wanted to add anything else before we take questions, and then also talk about what we have in store for the future.
So I think Amy covered it very well, but the places in which this is still in development are numerous, but on the legislative side, it's really this focus on the indoor standard. So we've seen legislation come into print. That bill number was 1434. That particular number is not going to move forward, but the author's office has said that what is in print is what they are going to be putting into another piece of legislation, and that is the recommendations that Amy presented earlier of 55 GPCD until 2025, and then that scaling down to 47 in 2025, and then again down to 42 in 2030. So that is going to be it's going to be a significant challenge on the legislative front. And the reason why I say that's going to be a challenge is because that's what DWR recommended, and there's an author moving that legislation. So I think that we're going to need to be mindful of what is possible within those realities. And that's just going to continue to develop. Obviously, we have RWA advocacy and board meetings, so you can expect to hear updates on that piece from me moving forward over the next several months into July and August. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you, Amy. I just want to make a brief remark about Amy's leadership in this. She's doing a great job. I think that the regulations are better up to date because of her engagement and her work in organizing sort of the water managers throughout California and engaging on this. I also frequently receive emails from people throughout the state praising Amy's leadership on this issue. So I just want to let the board members know that. At this point, I want to open it up to questions. I know that we presented on some, what I'll call some technically dense information, but I just want to open it up for some questions from the board members to see if they have anything that they would like to have answered based on this presentation.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Amy and Ryan. I wanted to echo your comments, Jim, about Amy. She's helped me out personally on understanding and navigating these sort of difficult regulations. They're horribly complicated. She's able to explain them in a simple way. That presentation was very high level and clear and understandable. And that is only symbolic of her understanding of the details of this legislation. And so thank you very much. It's also stepped up the statewide recognition of RWA as a leader in water, in my opinion. So thank you, Amy. We'll go to questions. Thanks. Paul Schubert, you're up first.
Yeah, mine really wasn't a question. It was just to echo what Jim mentioned. I received an email earlier today from one of my peers in Southern California praising Amy's leadership on this issue, and the fact that her involvement has definitely made it better. It's still problematic, obviously, but I just wanted to also throw out kudos to Amy because some of my peers in Southern California know her quite well and appreciate her leadership. So she's a statewide force.
Amy's popular today. Greg Zlotnick, you're next.
Thanks. I actually also just put it in the chat to take my hand down. It's just kudos to Amy. Superstar. Thanks.
Okay. Let's see. Well, I'll go ahead. Paul Helliker, you're next. I was contemplating just having comments and questions from board members first and then open up to the general public, but not seeing too many questions. I guess we can take it as it comes. So Paul, you're up. Paul Helliker.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, Amy, thanks for all the work that you've done. There has been a team of dedicated folks, Amy and Chelsea Haynes and Sue Mossberg and others that have been leading the charge on all of this. And I think we kind of reached a point of diminishing returns with the water loss model. A number of us met with the water board members, just as Amy and others did, and it's complicated. The staff have made it overly complex. And the water loss audits were never really intended for this purpose, but they're the foundation. So there's some fundamental problems with the whole approach, as Amy mentioned. So I hope people get a chance to look at the model and plug in their numbers. There's some kind of perverse results that you get from the model, but there's two basic factors, and I know we'll talk about this more tomorrow, that you can play with to try to get your loss reduction numbers down, but they are pretty onerous. 2/3 of the agencies in the state have to reduce water loss, and some, like Amy mentioned, are up to 90%, some of them in our region. So how feasible a standard is that requires 2/3 of the regulated community to take actions that may not be cost effective does raise the question about what are they really doing here. So, and then on the outdoor standard, I know Amy and others met with not just management, but Carla Namath and Chris Chernell at DWR about the outdoor standard, which frankly, the way they proposed it is infeasible. And they basically said, well, you know, we know that we don't have a solid justification for it, but there's a drought and we're just going to put those numbers out there. So they basically ignored all of the technical information that Amy and the Aqua team and others put together. And the numbers are as they're likely to be sent over to the State Water Board. So really the battle's going to go to the State Water Board, and we all need to be prepared for that. I think we need to prepare a campaign to address the outdoor standards at the State Water Board, because 0.65 ETAF in 2030, first of all, is not even allowed by the statute, but secondly is not likely to be achievable. So we need to make that case with the State Water Board. And then on the indoor standard, AB 1434 was the vehicle, but a number of water agencies began the lobbying effort with the Appropriations Committee, and the message got back to the author that her bill was not going to move. So she's decided to pull it back, and she's committed to putting a bill in that does exactly the same thing as the revised version of AB 1434 does. And we have a battle there that we need to work on. So, you know, RWA was in a leadership role on this front back in 2017 and 2018. If you recall, RWA and IRWD, Irvine Ranch, led the effort statewide, in part because Aqua wasn't stepping up. So I'm hoping that we get to continue that role here among RWA, and Amy's doing a great job, but she needs help. So we all need to pitch in.
Good. I have a question for any of the three staff that have presented on this. A number of years ago, I had the pleasure of a conversation with somebody higher up at DWR that was leading this effort, who talked about the transition from DWR to the water board and how the regulations would be considered. And they commented that there was an expectation. So the spirit of the legislation originally was efficient water use, regardless of outcome. And that's the way the legislation was written. Now we all see that the implementation has been written to squeeze as much out of efficiency as we can. And this person at DWR, I wouldn't want to name, said that there was talk of sort of a desired outcome of maybe, and at the time they said floating around 20% of urban water users in the state having to do something to reduce their water use. In other words, there's a little bit more than 400, maybe 430 water agencies in the state. Maybe 100 of them wouldn't make their budget and would have to do something. Totally a political outcome rather than a water efficient technical outcome. Have you heard anything? You know, Paul just suggested 2/3 of agencies didn't meet just the water loss standard alone. I'm curious, do you have any sense of statewide, out of 430 or so water agencies, how many of them will be within their budget now versus having to do something to get there? And have you heard any political suggestions about what would be acceptable to the water board?
I'll take a crack at that one, Tony. So I don't know about the statewide number. We think that based on the information that we've received, about a third of the RWA agencies are going to struggle with the regulations. About a third of them will probably get there with some work, and about a third of them probably meet the regulation right now. That's some very preliminary information. There's a lot more to learn. We're still in the regulatory rulemaking process, so more to come on that. But that's just our preliminary estimate. we'll see if that turns out to be right.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And yeah, I know that there's no certainty in responding to a question like that, but I think it's healthy for our board members to hear that, yeah, not everybody's going to make it, and that means we're going to have work to do. Okay, looking at the queue here.
Can I make a few more comments? I know we only have 13 minutes left of the board meeting, but I want to bring us back to the high level. Why does this matter? Well, okay, so an important piece of legislation. One reason why it matters is it may cost your agency some money. In order to comply, you might be fined. Your agency might be fined. Those fines might be pretty hefty in an event that we have a drought. You may have seen hopefully you have our memo relating to this that we sent out with the board package on this. It may be a real challenge for people of modest means if water agencies have to raise rates to cover those costs or to assist in reducing water use. That might be a challenge in the rate making process. It may be a challenge for tree health. If the regulations get to a point where water agencies need to squeeze some more savings out, it may be a real challenge because what might happen is people water less, and as a result, there could be some tree mortality. We saw that in the last drought. Roughly 8% of the trees in Sacramento died because of what happened with the emergency regulatory process as a result of that. So I'll also add that the policy issues are sticky, they're tricky. It appears that DWR and the State Water Board are developing the regulations to a point where they're trying to maximize the level of water use efficiency and water conservation out of this process. Just a personal perspective, sometimes I think that might be a little unfair. I will also say that the politics of the situation are really challenging for us. There was some discussion earlier in the board meeting about a bill Assemblymember Friedman is carrying forward. We want to engage in that in a way that we will get the best results possible. We want to be thinking about that. We'll be taking a position to the executive committee, first vetted with the regulatory advisory and legislative affairs committee first. We will be engaging in this to do the best that we possibly can, and also working with our partners in terms of developing the best situation out of a bad set of circumstances. More to come on that. Tony, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, you bet. We have one more hand up, and then I'd like to recommend something. But first, Greg Zlotnick has his hand up.
Thank you, Jim, and Amy and Ryan. One of the things that I find particularly frustrating with this, and I know the politics are difficult and the legislature doesn't particularly seem to care, at least those that are pushing these issues, is that just as from the start of this, the notion of forcing efficiency to the nth degree when it's not cost effective, basically ignores the supply side of the equation for agencies. And this region has a lot of agencies with very senior water rights and very reliable water supplies. And unfortunately, it seems as if we're being put in a position where that level of reliability and those rights are essentially being devalued because of a determination by whomever that, notwithstanding our urban water management plans and our water shortage contingency plans and our efficiency plans and everything else, that it just doesn't matter, and that you need to remove turf or not have turf, or go to the nth degree to stop water loss, when it's really of no benefit to your agency to do so. I just think it's important we don't lose sight of that as part of this discussion. And I would assume that for the agencies in this region and their boards, that is something that is of concern. And I don't think we want to lose sight of that.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Paul, I see you have your hand up. If you could be, because we've heard a lot from San Juan Water District now, if you could be succinct with your comments.
Sure, happy to do so. I didn't see anybody else's hand up, but look forward to hearing from them. So I just wanted to remind everybody what the original intent of SB 606 and AB 1668 was. In the statute, there's a specification that the legislative requirement is that the regulations adopted pursuant to those bills meet at least the conservation level that is accomplished by the 20 by 2020 program, SBX 77. So DWR and the State Water Board have actually analyzed that topic, and if you've seen their data, probably it correlates with your own data. The statewide water use right now is already 25% or more below the SBX 77 target. So just codifying existing use meets that requirement. And then when we did meet on this topic back in the Urban Advisory Group, I know Jim was there, others were there. We posed the question back when the legislation was being developed to the State Water Board management. What are you trying to accomplish here? Are you proposing that we do wholesale landscape conversions and massive reductions in indoor water use by whatever plumbing fixture retrofits we can do? And they said, nope, that's not what we're proposing. We're only proposing that people use water efficiently in their current configurations. So that was the agreement that we had with the State Water Board back then. They're deviating from that at this point, at least with the proposal from DWR. So again, I think we should marshal all of those arguments as we have the conversations in the legislature and before the State Water Board.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Seeing no other comments, I just want to provide a little bit of feedback on how to navigate forward as RWA staff. So you have a state advocacy legislative committee that meets under Ryan's leadership that normally would form positions on these kinds of issues. Given the complexity of what we're talking about with this legislation, how it gets implemented, and then there are a lot of political ramifications to outcomes. There's also financial and operational implications to outcomes for your member organizations. My feedback would be to take the kind of the feedback from the advocacy group that Ryan meets with and vet it with perhaps the executive committee, or something like that, just to make sure that we're kind of capturing the full RWA membership a bit, and that we kind of work through the details of this, because there's a lot of strategy and a lot of politics into the outcomes here. So just some feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. With that, I'm going to see if there's any other questions. We just want to do a quick update. I know we have this meeting scheduled for 90 minutes. I suggested earlier it was 60. We don't want to take too much of your time. We wanted to do a quick update on this and let you know what the state of affairs were with respect to the regulatory development. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to suggest to the chair that he gavel the meeting to a close.
Okay.
Is Greg doing the Vulcan thing? Okay.
Greg, happy to hear from you again. Please be succinct if you could.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm responding to your comment, actually.
Oh.
I'm curious about it. You said that, vet through the executive committee, which is fine. Then you said it's important that all the members are heard. To me, that would mean making sure it gets through the board and not just the executive committee. I don't know what you were implying. So I wanted to just get a better understanding of what your suggestion was.
Oh, fair enough. What the executive committee meets more regularly. Again, I don't have the details in my mind about the timeline of implementation of this, and the board only meets every other month. And so that's why I said the executive committee. I'd actually prefer the board, Greg,
Okay.
but I don't know if the board could keep up with Amy's needs.
Okay, fair enough.
Mr. Chair, just one other procedural thing with respect to what Mr. Zlotnick brought up. The committee, this we call it the RAP or something like that. It's the Regulatory and Advocacy Committee, Program Committee. They meet on a monthly basis, generally throughout the year. That will be an opportunity for members to engage or have their folks that are involved quite a bit on legislative affairs engage to channel the interest of their organizations. We don't want that to become a meeting under the Brown Act. We want to encourage that we don't have a lot of board members showing up to that one. A couple board members are okay, but there's a threshold where we'll get to where we'll get ourselves into trouble. They provide input on recommendations for positions on legislation. I see Ryan has just gone off camera, so he's going to maybe amend what I said. The positions get forwarded to the executive committee for ratification or change for RWA policy. Ryan may want to talk more about that. Ryan Becerra, counsel. And with that, I'm going to stop to see if Ryan wants to say anything else.
Yeah, just a couple things. So relative to the attendance at the regulatory and advocacy program, the trickiest thing is that if we have 5 executive committee members attending, we now have a Brown Act issue because of you have a quorum of the executive committee attending. So that's the trickiest thing. The board, it would be pretty hard to get a full quorum of the board of directors there. So just we'll have to make sure we have fewer than 5 executive committee members at any given meeting there. And then, yeah, I believe under policy 100.5, in terms of taking positions on legislation, the normal process is that there's a recommendation to the executive committee, which the executive committee then does with it what it will. Towards the end of session, we often get into emergency situations that different procedures apply, but that's not where we are at the moment. We're early in the session.
Okay. With that, are there any more remaining questions? Otherwise, we'll adjourn the board meeting. Seeing none, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.